I was recently asked a question on GM discretion and just how far does GM discretion go? What does it mean? And why are so many things about GM discretion? So I started doing a little bit of looking, a little bit of research, a little bit of kind of searching the web, seeing what the general meta was about it. And then you start getting into rule of cool and how that is different than GM discretion and where the limits are and how you keep it consistent. So that is what I want to talk about today. My name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist. And let's go ahead and get into it. Now, first, I kind of want to define both of these terms, at least in my opinion, which is why I'm going to put this under the opinion banner. I think when I came up with this category, I said I wasn't going to be doing a lot of opinions, but then I get asked questions that really depend on opinions. So here we are again. Now, I want to say GM discretion is when situations, either in the adventure, in the encounter, something happens that causes the rules to not exactly apply or might be a modifier to apply. And therefore, it is up to the GM to decide if they want to allow a bonus, a penalty, a player character to do a certain action based on what the new circumstances of the situation are. Now, very fortunately, there are some pretty good examples of what GM discretion is and how far it goes. But then we get into rule of cool. And rule of cool is kind of like GM discretion on steroids. And what at least my interpretation of the rule of cool is, and what I've read a lot online, condensed into as few words as possible, is I want to do this thing, but it needs to be awesome. That's the rule of cool. Usually, rule of cool is when you want to do something that will either in role play, the way you describe it, theater of the mind, however you want to categorize it, it is going to be awesome, but not technically within the rules of the game. I guess a really quick one I can think of off the top of my head is let's go with an anime, right category for rule of cool. And we'll do every anime ever. It doesn't matter whether it's slice of life or romance. There's going to be a situation where somebody jumps up in the air, floats in the air for 10 minutes while they give a long exposition about how the villain destroyed their family and ruined their life. And then at the end of that exposition, they do a single punch that kills the bad guy. Nowhere in the rules does that really come into effect. A round is 6 seconds. So you are not going to be able to do a 10-minute exposition while floating in the air, even if you can fly between your actions. That's just not how that works. But it certainly seems really cool to do, especially if that is a core arc of your character. So that is my definition of rule of cool. There are other ones out there, and I'm sure there are tons of examples. And you know what? I'd love to hear about what the most outrageous rule of cool thing that you've ever come across. I'm not saying that they're always bad, but they are by definition kind of game breaking because they do break the rules. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a rule of cool thing. It would be GM discretion. And they can be useful once in a while. However, there might be a way to control them a little bit. And it's a thought I have and something that I have done in the past and in games I've participated in. This has been the limiting factor for a rule of cool ruling. So let's go ahead and first start out, though, with what GM discretion is. Now, right in the Game Master Guide, and I'll go ahead and include the page number in the description for this particular video. And when the remaster comes out, then I'll be able to update that page number as well when it comes out. And once again, when the remaster comes out, I'll start saying the page numbers in the videos again. But I just don't want to have to redo stuff twice just because of the remaster. So we're just going to go ahead and do it that way. But there is a very good section in the Game Mastery Guide, and it is in the Game Master Basics section, and it's called Saying Yes, But. Now, what I like about that particular header, and it even says so in the text, is you're basically using a variant of the rule of, yes, you can do that, but you're saying, yes, you can do that, but. In other words, for them to get the particular thing that is just a slight modification to the rules, there might be consequences to doing that. Here is a very good example of one that I've very recently come across, and that is, let's say you're trying to climb a rope and you have a character who has a very poor athletic score, which is what you use to climb, but instead they have a very high acrobatic score. Maybe because they took all the skills for it. Maybe they have a high dex. Maybe they have acrobat background. Maybe they're a performer, and therefore that's why they have that very high acrobatics. But you would think that an acrobat would be able to climb a rope, even if they're not that strong. Okay, that's valid. What you can do is you can allow the player to roll against their acrobatics. However, make it a higher DC, or you could make the climb, instead of taking one action to do 5 to 10 feet, maybe make that take the whole round because they're not using strength, they're using acrobatics. Maybe they were one of those, if you've seen it in circuses or seen it in performances, where you have those silk dancers who do acrobatics while they're in silk, and then they'll wrap themselves up and drop down and do all these very performative actions. That's not necessarily quick, except for when they drop. So maybe that's how they're getting up the rope, as opposed to using athletics and using acrobatics. So there is a way to sometimes allow that discretion to happen without really doing anything game breaking, and it will allow you to be consistent because you came up with a solution. And that's kind of the biggest thing about discretion and GM discretion, is you need to be consistent. Now, there are some examples from the yes but section, and I'm going to go ahead and read a couple that I kind of like, but I do encourage you to take a look if you really have any questions about this. One of them was to require a check, then apply a circumstance penalty or a condition to a foe. And the example they have for that particular one is you want to throw a barrel over a monster's head for some reason. And then a really good one that I kind of like here, that is for attacks, is, let's say that you have a troll and the troll needs fire damage in order to actually damage them. Well, the fighter sees a brazier with lit oil over on the side. He dips his sword in the lit oil. Therefore, he has the flaming oil on his sword. And for one attack, he gets fire damage. Even just 1 point, but it's enough in order to damage the troll. These are little things that aren't specifically spelled out in the rule, but your player characters have come up with a really interesting solution that makes sense, but you don't necessarily have the rules sitting up there in your head on how exactly to do it. These are things that you can do, and they allow you to be consistent because they make sense. They aren't particularly game breaking, and it allows for better enjoyment at the table because people who weren't able to actually do something before now have an action that they can do. And then another good version that's good when you're live at the table in this yet but section is you basically allow this thing to occur once, and you tell your players they are allowed to do it once, mainly because you are unsure of what the game rules or how much this particular thing will impact the game. So you tell them, I'm going to allow this time, but before the next session, I want to go ahead and look up the rules and make sure this is something that we can do consistently. That way, you are basically putting something in the actual adventure at the table now and letting it progress, but you are also qualifying it, saying that you're not sure if this is something that you're going to do every single time. It basically creates some boundaries that you can use in order to be a good GM and to allow the enjoyment at the table to continue. Now, another good section I found about basically Game Master discretion is actually on the Organized Play website. They have a section, and I'll go ahead and include a link to that in the description as well, but it is basically the Game Master Basics section, and it gives some examples on, well, you know what? I'm going to use their words. GMs are encouraged to make choices which would result in the most enjoyable play experience for everyone at the table, and that emphasize to the PCs that they are the heroes of the story. And then they go ahead and give some examples of what GM discretion can include in organized play. Creatures' tactics that have been invalidated by the player's actions, the reactions of NPCs to good role playing, and the effect that that has on the outcome of the encounter. And kind of like we were saying for the acrobatics versus athletics for climbing, alternate or creative skills used to bypass or overcome traps, haunts, and skill checks. And then another good one. This is, I can see why it's very important for organized play, because organized play are much smaller adventures, but moving plot points missed by the players to encounterable areas. So let's say you bypassed an NPC or bypassed a monster where you were supposed to learn something from. You might be able to just nudge that encounter a little bit further down the path so that the story can continue without them missing a major plot point. Now, I do want to go into what the rule of cool is and maybe how you can rein that in a little bit. So I actually found, and I'll include this link in the description as well, a very official sounding definition of rule of cool. It was basically the RPG Museum at fandom.com. And it was, I'm going to read it here directly. The limit of a group's willing suspension of disbelief for any given element in a story is directly proportionate to its awesomeness. That is as good a description of the rule of cool as I could possibly find. And what it basically means is that the players at the table and you as the GM, once again, I believe that the GM is a player as well, are there to have fun. So what's the harm in allowing something awesome? And that is good in theory, but if it is game breaking and sets a precedent, then are you really playing Pathfinder anymore? Pathfinder is a very balanced, a very rules dependent system. And by allowing game breaking things to occur on a regular basis, then you're kind of not playing it anymore. If that is what is cool for your table, because once again, Pathfinder is what you make of it. If you remember, from the player's guide, when you first read it, one of those first sentences is, this is your game. So you can make the game as hardcore to the rules or as rules light as you want it to be, but inconsistency basically can damage groups and damage the adventure. Where GM discretion kind of gives you some leeway in order to have a better narrative and do some better storytelling and have something make sense, when by rules it just might not for the specific situation that you're in. Rule of cool is once again doing that 10-minute monologue while in the middle of a jump before you hit the monster between your first and second action. That's just not realistic. But there could be ways to allow certain rule of cool things to happen while limiting just how often they can do it and just how game breaking it can be. One of the first things that you can stipulate is that rule of cool can't directly violate any rules. So if someone wants to be the hero and they have poor athletics and they don't have an acrobatics, so they can't even do the GM discretion thing, they just want to say that, well, there's this NPC over here that I've kind of had my eye on for a while and I really want to impress her. So I want to run up that hill and climb all the way up to the top without using the rope. And that way she'll notice me. That isn't supported by the rules at all. However, you could potentially use another skill. Once again, if they have a good performance skill, if they have, a good social skill or a good diplomacy skill, they could have a group of people kind of form a pyramid and use that in order to impress the NPC that they were trying to impress by using the people as some type of ladder in order to get up to the top. There's nowhere in the rules that it would state that you could do that. But, it is something that would allow the game to move forward without letting someone who is poor in athletics, poor in acrobatics, doesn't have good strength score, doesn't have good dexterity score, to somehow manage to impress the NPC. They were trying to kind of notice them a little bit. And the other thing I could think of is you can allow certain things to occur that might be considered against the rules if the player, well, first of all, it needs to be reasonable. You can't have someone fall 1,500 feet out of the sky and do a superhero landing while taking no damage, regardless of what concession you're willing to make, because that is so far from realistic. it's not even really funny. However, you could do something like make them use a hero point in order to jump out of a 20 or 30-foot tower with minimal damage and no permanent damage, like no broken wrists or broken kneecap because you did decide to do that superhero landing. But because they have to use a consumable item, by that I meaning a hero point, it limits the amount of times that it can be used. And it also puts a limit on what they can actually do. Maybe the player isn't trying to do the 1,500 feet. Maybe the player is trying to jump down 50 feet and they have 30 feet of rope. Let them climb down, tie it off, let them climb down the 30 feet, and then it's a 20-foot drop, and then do the superhero landing as long as they use their hero point. It doesn't even have to be a roll if you don't want to. And that's where we go back circularly to the GM discretion. It depends on what the GM wants to allow at the table. Now, this whole video has pretty much been my opinion on what GM discretion and the rule of cool are. Yours might be different. GM discretion is defined fairly well. Rule of cool, it's all over the place. So I expect some of them to be different, and I would encourage the discussion to occur, be it, in my comments. Let it happen on Reddit. Let it happen in your local Discord. Let it happen at your local game store. But it is part of the game, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And I feel in limited doses, it really does add to the adventure, adds to the fun, but you need to make sure that it doesn't take over the game. Now, I hope you did enjoy this video. And if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.